Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive! This week's discussion is part 2 of my ongoing series of videos on Legend of the Five Rings. I will be discussing the card game, history of the role-playing game and its editions. I will be going over the intellectual property ownership and how that's changed hands. Because a lot of people think games stay in one company the whole life of the property. And that's not usually the case. Games change hands, intellectual properties change hands. Legend of the Five Rings is a more straightforward example, but it's a great example of this tendency. So sit back and enjoy listening to this discussion. 1995 was a noticeable year for card games. This was the year that Magic was 2 years old at this point, thus having proved that card games could create a sustainable market, and everyone was kind of jumping on the bandwagon. There was a Highlander card game in production, TSR had their Spellfire card game, and this little company called Alderac Entertainment Group decided they were going to make a game. And this game was going to be story-based. And this game was Legend of the Five Rings. The events and tournaments influenced the story. The story was often told through the cards in the expansion packs during these early days. And this is how things developed. It developed organically, and in the video I posted on last week's description, that told the story of how everything led up to the Day of Thunder. But another thing happened in 1997 as well as the Day of Thunder. That was the publication of the Legend of the Five Rings role-playing game. This first edition, many of the books of it are still looked at heavily by fans of the setting because they laid the foundation. In fact, until Emerald Empire was published by AEG for 4th edition, the first edition Emerald Empire was one of the most sought after out-of-print books ever for the game. Because it was the only book that detailed everything about the setting. Every little social interaction, every nuance. And in fact, it is still sought after. Because nostalgia. Because it detailed the Empire right around the time of the Clan War. And there's not much dealing with that until the Imperial Histories from AEG released for 4th edition. 2nd edition was released a few years later, 1999, as a sort of refinement of the rules. But something else happened in 1999. But let's step back for a moment. So when Legend of the Five Rings was created, in addition to AEG, they had gotten a bunch of investors who created Five Rings Publishing Group. These investors bought the IP, but continued licensing it to AEG. And this group was bought out in 1999 by Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast took over publishing the card game, though AEG's people still developed it. They still kept the same development team. But they did something interesting. They reprinted and made a new edition of an old D&D book called Oriental Adventures. And they changed the default setting, since they now owned the IP to Rokugan. And then they published supplements. Now, what's interesting about these supplements is that many of these supplements are not just D&D stats. They would have the D20 D&D stats in there, yes. But then they'd have blue text that was all the stuff for the roll and keep system. They were basically dual mechanic books. And this was cool as heck. But then, a couple years later, Hasbro bought out Wizards of the Coast. And Hasbro kind of decided they didn't like Legend of the Five Rings. Don't know why, but they decided to sell off the property. And AEG managed to win the bidding war for the intellectual property, bringing the whole game back into their hands. And with that, they released a third edition of the role-playing game. And with that third edition, it was a sort of revitalization of the role-playing game. It was still the same system. It was still tweaked to work better, but you could still pretty much use stuff from the old books with minor adjustments in the third edition. And then they developed the fourth edition for the 15th anniversary of Legend of the Five Rings. This fourth edition, they rebuilt from the ground up. They went through it with the idea that there would be no sacred cows. They made adjustments, they rebalanced things. Though understand, by rebalance, I don't mean game balance. I mean, they rebalanced it so that if a school was supposed to be the best at something, they were. The Kikita Duelist School, the Kikita Bushi, the Kikita Duelist School, that became the best, bar none duelist. Except, for, of course, for the Minamoto Bushi School, which were supposed to be the only school that was their equal. And different little things were done. They balanced it, they rearranged things. And then they made it timeline neutral. What that meant was the rules in the core book were not focused on a specific period of time. All the previous editions were focused on when in the card game that book was published. The fourth edition, while they included stuff for the time period it was in, they made it as timeline neutral as they could. They included rules for schools and clans that no longer existed. They included stuff that actually wouldn't show up in the game for a bit, or in the setting for a bit. They put stuff from the past, present, and with that, the fourth edition came along. The fourth edition is my favorite edition of the game, as it was under AEG. And for me, it's accessible. I have all but 2 of the books, and I love it just because it was a more interesting way of approaching the game. It's one where I could drop the game into any period in the history of Rokugan, and we could go with it. Of course, in 2015, the 20th anniversary of Legend of the Five Rings, a momentous event happened. Something that lost a lot of fans, but ultimately could have reinvigorated the game as well. And what that was AEG sold the game. They sold the whole intellectual property to Fantasy Flight Games. In 2017, Fantasy Flight released the new edition, the living card game version of the Legend of the Five Rings card game. And that was a fun event. I was there on release day at Gen Con. Picture it. You are in front of the main doors of the exhibit hall at Gen Con. There are hundreds of people crammed in like sardines right where you are. You look around, many of them are wearing Legend of the Five Rings t-shirts, wearing kimonos of their clans, and all during the time you're standing there waiting for the doors to open, this guy in a Haruma, one of the families of the Crab Clan kimonos, works his way forward. And, he gets right up there to the front. And you're like, this is interesting. What's going on with this? Well, maybe he just wants to be one of the first people through the door. Alright. So, you get the safety brief. The, I will not run. I will not run speech from the guy in front of the door. And the doors open. But all the staff are standing there like this. The rope is still up. And you look through. You look through the doors. You watch the Fantasy Flight booth. That's right there. And you see these people there. They're all smiling. They're all happy. They're taking pictures. And then, the rope's taken down. And the staff are still standing there like this. And this guy in the Haruma kimono starts shouting, "For the glory of the Emperor! For the glory of Rokugan! Oots!" And everyone there automatically goes into the response of Banzai! And he goes through the Oots Banzai call and repeat a total of 3 times. The first time, the AEG staff are still smiling. The second time, you watch their faces go, a brief look of confusion start entering in. And then the third time, just before the staff make the motion like this to start people walking, that look of confusion changes to a look of terror as they're finally processing how many people were just doing that call and response. And then everyone storms in. And you're watching the AEG people panic jump over the counter into the booth. And it was just funny But that was the release day at Gen Con of the Legend of the Five Rings card game. And the new version's a living card game. It's not collectible. So you buy the expansion pack, you've got full play sets of all the cards. And that's cool. It makes it much more accessible, much more easy to get into. Though there is a sort of downside in that it doesn't have the constant buying and selling like a collectible card game does. But it's more accessible, it's easier to get into. And then this past year, 2018, they released their new version of the role-playing game. Now, the mechanics of the role-playing game are different in the new edition. At this point, we have now gone through 3 different mechanical iterations of the game. Of the core mechanics of the game. We've had the standard roll and keep system, where it would be a trait plus skill, number of dice, and you keep a number of dice out of those equal to the trait. And you add those all up. Then we had a D20 system, basically D&D. And now we've got the new version, which is still keeping dice, rolling and keeping dice. You pick an approach that determines what ring you're using. You roll that many dice plus the skill. But you have ring dice, you have skill dice, and each die is different, but they're not numerical. They're narrative dice. And that changes the dynamic a lot. Makes it more story driven. Makes it more each die roll tells a story. But this is what brings us to today. And this is the end of this part of the story of Legend of the Five Rings. Next week, I really want to talk about the other aspects of it, the actual stories of the game, because that's another aspect. I'm going to be talking about various other things. The Heroes of Rokugan living campaign, some of the major story events over the course of the game. I look forward to seeing you next week. If you liked this, please click like and subscribe down below. And remember, everyone, have fun and keep gaming.